Welcome to this episode of Unstoppable Journeys. My name is Ryan Gubick, founder and personal CFO of MRG Wealth, and I'd like to introduce you to a special guest we have today, Rick Timlick, CEO of Blaze Performance. Welcome, Rick.
Hello, thank you for having me here.
Oh, thanks for coming today. We were talking a couple months ago about a big challenge, a big problem in kind of workplace culture right now, with lack of engagement and motivation leading into numerous issues for employees and employers. Can you share a bit about kind of that problem that you love and you focus on solving?
Yeah, so at Blaze, we look at that engagement and retention area. And you know, that study of positive psychology in organizations have been going on for probably greater than 40 years. But they're now just able to correlate it to strategic outcomes in organizations. And I can give you many examples, but one of the things that we try to do, and we often say is, as an employee, you've bought my C game. By virtue of the contract we have, you get my C game. Anything above that is discretionary. So if you want my A game, what's the environment and context that I'm going to be working within that I want to give that to the organization?
That's a really good point. Can you break down a bit more what you mean by C game and A game?
Yeah. For those maybe non-athletes out there, so the C game is, what's the table stakes I've got to meet to stay on the team, right?
So it's transactional, day-to-day.
You got it. Yeah, those things I have to do that I know if I do X, Y, and Z, I'll stay employed. And that's okay, and chances are we've got a number of those people in our teams and in our organizations. But to get the creativity, to get the innovation, to get the extra performance out of people, we've got to be able to tap into their discretionary effort. And that only comes when they're willing to give it to us.
Thinking outside the box and kind of going above and beyond. Is that kind of the A game?
Yeah, absolutely. When they're willing to stay there, and it's not always just about staying late. It's about when I'm here, how present am I, right? Or am I worried about other things? When I'm here and when I'm in meetings, how much am I giving of my time and energy and creative talents and capabilities so that we can get the best of that individual and collectively all win as an organization?
And that's a really good point. I love how you said it's not about staying late. And quite often I'll hear individuals talk about input versus output.
Yep.
Right? So the hours that an employee puts in or anyone puts into a task, that's the input, doesn't necessarily equate to the output that everyone's looking for.
It doesn't translate often well. And there are people that are very good at filling that time of an 8-hour workday, for example. But you look at the end of the week, what's actually was produced for an output for the organization. And it can be very low if they're not really focused on what's important and critical to the organization.
And so what does this problem kind of do? What does it manifest and cause pain for the organization and for the employees themselves? What do you see that turn into if it's not solved?
Yeah. We've probably seen good examples of this coming out of COVID. And I'll give you just an analogy. Do you remember they had that story of if you put a frog in warm water and slowly crank the boil up, and the frog would stay there, right? And eventually it would boil itself to death. And I think as employees, we were put into that warm water, and as cutbacks happen and layoffs happen and we were expected to do more with less, the water cranked up in temperature. And as that water cranked up in temperature, we got used to being in a boiling environment. And now we've left that boiling environment over COVID. We've had a chance to breathe and look around. And organizations are struggling with, we want everybody to come back, or do we have some hybrid work environment or something? And the employees are saying, hold on a second, it's actually quite nice not being in the boiling water. I'm not sure I want to go back. Now that comes in many forms, as we were talking about. It's either quiet quitting, which means I'm showing up, but I'm really not there and I'm just collecting a paycheck. It could come in the form of I'm actually thinking of leaving my organization. In fact, some of the stats this year say that 70% of Canadians are thinking about leaving their jobs.
70%?
70%. It's an astronomical level.
Wow.
And so I'm either quietly quitting, I'm thinking of leaving my job. I'll put in the time because maybe I'm close to that retirement age and I want to get my package, and so I'm just doing that. But any of those three scenarios don't get my best, and the organization doesn't get the best performance for their customers either, right? And so what we want to do is we want to be able to say, what's the right context and environment that allows them to come back? It allows them to come back and contribute to their best. And also, what happened in the organization that maybe we turned the boil up a little bit too high, right? There's probably good stress in every organization because there's competition and market demands and all those things. But the bad stress is, what do we do internally that creates excess bureaucracy? What do we do internally that people don't feel belonging or inclusive? What do we do internally that they can't even see the growth? They can't see the career path to get to the next level.
Yeah, I can't see the kind of through the fog or through the storm, per se. So This is a big problem. Clearly, if there's 70% for the study that you mentioned that people are looking at leaving their job, what made you want to solve this problem? Can you share a bit about your story and kind of your journey
Sure.
of why create Blaze Performance and why solve this specific problem?
Yeah. So for me, my career started, I was with a very large global metals company, and I was a manager way too young and probably a little too brash. And I kept wondering, why don't we just do things differently? Because the mentality coming back to me from all the senior people in the organization was, it really was about the same things they've always done. And it was my least favorite phrase because there's 1,000 ways to solve a problem. So I thought, okay, if the organizational imperative is kind of status quo and hope that things get better, I'm going to see what I can do to make things a little bit better. And so I actually started my career getting, the Master Black Belt in Six Sigma, learning about the lean production and all those operational tools to make things get better, as well as management philosophies to get things better. But the missing piece really was, how do I get people brought onto that? And so I've spent about 15 plus years of my career trying to figure out how do we get the best out of people? Because at the end of the day, all the results you get generally boil down to what are people doing in your organization, right? And so it was a problem that we thought it's really paramount out there to get really well. And you can see the difference between companies that do it well and companies that don't. And more importantly to me and to my team is you can see the difference in the people that are there in those environments. And that over anything is what really drives us, is when you go to one of those environments where people are willingly giving that discretionary effort, there's a different energy, there's a different feel, there's a different level of belonging in the organization. And that's really cool to be part of.
Can you feel the want to be there versus have to be there?
Totally, yes, yeah. And the commitment to the organization too, right? You'll see this often in nonprofit organizations where people are really passionate about, like they talk about it outside of work. They're part of different committees and boards to further that cause that they're passionate about. We can have that same in private organizations where people are actually passionate about it and they're talking about their projects with their friends. They're talking about the organization and where it's going. Like it's a visceral difference.
That's a really good word and good point, passion. Right? With potentially 70% of people thinking about, is this the right job for me?
Yeah.
It does, and 30%, I'm not sure if in the survey 30% were very passionate, or that was just they weren't looking at leaving that year.
They weren't looking at leaving, yeah.
So what leaves a very small pie or piece of the organization that's actually got their A game moving forward, passion towards it. That's really interesting because without passion, how do we move the needle versus just the transactional day to day?
And the biggest challenge organizations have today is trying to connect their purpose to individual motives, values, purpose, and things like that, right? So if the purpose of my organization is purely profit, chances are I'll want to hire people that are focused on earning a part of that profit. But I think in today's demographics, the amount of people that are interested in just focusing on that is very low. People really care about what is it that I'm choosing to do for work? What is it I'm choosing to do for my spending? What is it I'm choosing to do for any of those other things that are important to me? And so organizations that are able to connect purpose to their employees' purpose and values really find that passion goes up.
That's another really good point. Do you find there's a big disconnect in terms of employees not even knowing what that values and vision is? So they can't even make the decision whether it aligns with them or not?
I do. In fact, what I find is it's not that they don't know what the value is. So the values might be listed somewhere, and you'll have a list of 5 or 7 different values. But what employees often struggle with is, how do I operationalize that term? And is how I operationalize it the same as how my leader operationalizes it and how their leader operationalizes it? Like, is there alignment? Can I see that congruency on how we live that value? But I bet in most organizations, if you pick any value like integrity as an example, and you go to 50 different employees and say, how would you operate in a way that demonstrated integrity in this organization? Chances are you'll get a lot of different answers, right? So it makes it hard for them to say, okay, I can see my value is integrity, and I know what that means to me, but the organization lists the value of integrity, but it actually has a different meaning and context. So I struggle in order to live that.
Sounds like that translation piece is missing in a gap.
Yeah, that's a huge component.
So can you share with us a bit about the solution that Blaze Performance and yourself and the team developed to solve this big problem around workplace engagement and helping people fulfill their passions?
Yeah, so going back to the Six Sigma days, obviously it's very data driven. And one of the benefits of having that experience is we learned how to make meaning out of the data and how to make meaning in a quick way so that you can act and make decisions better. So combine that with in organizations, there's a lot of data driven around, are people actually engaged and are you likely to retain them? You can look at, for example, sick days, long-term disability, short-term disability. Are they taking advantage of that? Is there more than you like as a curve? Some organizations that we work with, you'd say, if I could keep my employee here for 3 years, I'm likely to have them to be a 10, 15-year employee. But it's keeping them up to that 3 years that I struggle with, right? And so there's a lot of data within organizations, and what we do is we just try to say, here's data you want to pay attention to, and here's the meaning that you extract from that data. And the other thing that we do, and we've developed a technology to really measure, I'll call it sentiment or mood in organizations. So we can keep a pulse on organizations in such a way that that retention, that engagement piece, we can be predictive of organizations actually doing it. And that becomes a game changer for organizations that care about those issues.
Interesting. So is there leading indicators that you're using the data to track to help do that predictive analysis?
Yeah, so on the sentiment side of it, it's a daily mood reflection. And so we ask employees either every day, a few times a week, or at least once a week, what their mood is as it relates to work and the work that they're doing. Now, when team sentiment starts to drop, we have an AI that kicks in that will start to do a diagnostic and ask some questions around why is team sentiment dropping? And so with that data aggregated over a population over a time period, we can get fairly accurate picture of what's going on in that organization so that the HR strategies that they're doing actually have meaning to organizations, right? They actually mean something to individuals instead of it being a broad spray and pray.
That's really interesting. And you said AI really quickly there.
Yeah.
And that's interesting in itself because I think workplace surveys are not new.
Sure.
Sometimes people don't do them very often. It might be once a year. Frequency can change, but I think many employees have seen workplace surveys before.
Yeah.
What I don't think is very common that I've at least heard before is integrating AI in that with the frequency that you talked about so that you can get ahead of it without waiting a year or 2 years to do the survey. And it's like, oh, I'm not happy. I haven't been happy for 16 months.
Right.
You get ahead of it and AI is able to ask, if I'm understanding you correctly, is it asking different questions based on how they're answering their mood?
Yeah. So to address the AI piece, we built it on a structure based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So you think in an organization, my base need is to be safe. I want to know that I'm physically safe and I have a psychological safety. And now, if I can have that need met, then the next need is, do I feel like I'm part of the team? Am I part of the organization? Is there a sense of belonging or inclusion, right? And if I feel that need is met, I can move up and I can say, am I able to connect my work to the purpose of the organization? Because in the absence of that, I just go to what's busy or loud or urgent, right? So being able to connect to a purpose. And the third, and this was when Maslow talked about self-actualization, to an employee, am I growing and developing with the organization in a way that keeps me motivated and engaged, right? And so the AI is looking at those 4 factors, and it's going to start to ask, a few questions based on each of these factors. And so it'll start to be able to point into, well, it's a sense of belonging, and specifically to belonging. I've been here 3 months, and I actually still haven't really made a friend around work, right? So I still feel alone and isolated kind of thing. Chances are if that employee continues on that trend, he's going to be more and more disengaged. And so knowing that data early on enough over a population, we can start to then suggest, what are you going to do differently? To your point, you talked about those annual surveys, and we've created many of those annual surveys. We use them now for different purposes. If it's just a once a year annual survey, chances are it takes probably a couple months to collect the data. Then you got to form themes to act on that data if you have time and capacity and the knowledge of what to do with that data, right? Now, I know organizations that are very large, they measure this every 3 years. And yet they haven't really moved their score that much. And if you think of every 3 years, if I've got a 15 or 20% turnover, I've lost at least half of those employees that I initially invested in asking their feedback for. So I've got a new batch of employees. So the data starts to become meaningless the longer you spread it out. And so we thought if we can get as close to real time as possible, we've got a shot of actually being predictable what the challenges are.
That makes a lot of sense. And what's the feedback on both sides, the employee side filling out these surveys as well as the employer side? Because sometimes, when people are busy and you're adding another task to their desk, what's the, common perception of that? Is it welcomed? Is it more of a pain? Is it what's been the experience?
It actually has depended on the organization and on how middle management has actually positioned it. And that really for us is the biggest factor. And in fact, in most organizations, middle management is the make or break kind of layer in organizations, right? Because you'll have those people that are front facing, and then you'll have management trying to push down objectives and things like that. And so for us, what we find is if we can make it super simple, super easy, super intuitive, and part of their natural workflow, they're likely to adopt it relatively quickly. And we don't ask them a lot. In fact, what we do is we ask them 3 questions, and it takes less than 90 seconds a day. And the first question is, what is your mood? The second question is, what are you going to do today in order to make the organization better? And the third question is there someone that you want to give a high five or congratulate or leave feedback on some of the actions they've taken? And so those 3 things have really created a cohesive unit within teams and departments and organizations focused on improvement and engagement and retention.
And they're emotional triggers. Like even just as you mentioned those, I was reflecting on myself. I'm like, I think I'd like to be asked that. And other people, like who doesn't like to be asked, how are you doing today?
Yeah.
Right?
And the opportunity to put a spotlight on some of the things that I'm doing that really are helping the organization succeed in the world, right? Whether it's a nonprofit or for-profit, it doesn't matter. I've taken some actions that I'm really proud of. And now I get to put that out there, say, here's what I did, and people can high five or leave a comment or say, hey, that sounds like a best practice. Can we incorporate that in other areas?
Excellent. And the other really important piece I find with surveys or can make or break a survey is the action after it, right? So if someone asks me for my opinion and I say, okay, here's my opinion on something, or here's a challenge, or I'm taking the time to share something with you, and it's never executed.
Yeah.
It kind of falls flat quickly. And then the next time you ask me, I might not want to share as much. How does the execution side around the surveys, feedback and answers go all the way up to either upper management to execute and then back down to the person that said that feedback as well? So that there's that 360-degree feedback loop.
Yeah, so what we found is on our platform, we looked at making very simple, robust dashboards. Something that an executive can look at and act quickly. Something that a manager can look at and respond to relatively quickly. It was, how can we make the data accessible and simple enough to translate to action? Because a lot of the reports we get, and even general corporate reports, whether it's a financial or operational report, I might be looking for 30% of the data that's actually on the report, but it's inundated with a bunch of other data. And so knowing that, we wanted to strip out how much could we strip out of this so that someone can actually see and have a sense of my overall team's health is this, and here's what I need to do next in order to improve that. So highly actionable, highly tactile, highly visible.
Amazing. And that's another big difference that you quite often don't hear about when you're talking about surveys and employee engagement, that actionable piece. And I love how you kind of shared, simplifying the complex of all that data and turning it into information that's actionable.
Yeah, that's the target. I mean, we've done annual surveys for many years. And one of the things that I found is after the first year, when they had a sense that you're listening, if you respond, the second year, they'll actually be more honest. If you don't respond, the participation rate just drops down. So I often tell organizations, if you only do an annual survey, don't be surprised if you actually take action that the next year your survey results drop. But if you keep consistently taking action, you'll find the third year you'll have a dramatic spike up.
Yeah, it's kind of proof that someone's listening.
Right, exactly.
And do you have a client story or success story that you can share of someone that had this problem, implemented the Blaze Performance solution that you just shared with us, and kind of what the outcome was?
Yeah, I'll give one. It's a company most of us know, NASA, as an organization. I did some work with them a really long time ago, and the work really was around engagement and building trust in organizations and a management leadership development aspect.
And this is NASA space exploration, right?
Throwing rockets up into the air.
Yeah. Very cool.
Yeah, so it was a lot of fun. And when we developed our platform, I went back to NASA saying, hey, I know some of the challenges you had at the time you weren't able to resolve. I think we've got something that could be a little more sophisticated to help you resolve the challenge. And the challenge they had at the time was for every new grad they hired, they only lasted about 6, 7, 8 months. And so if I hired 6 new grads, within 9 months, I've lost 4 of them, right? So it was a very expensive venture. They're often, paying for these new grads to have bonuses or incentives or pay back some of their student loans. And so they said, can you do a bit of a diagnostic to understand what's going on in the organization? And then from that, help us devise what's the plan forward, right? Now, the diagnostic, when organizations do exit interviews, they often don't yield a lot. In fact, the most common sentiment is they left for more money. And in reality is that's actually probably an inverse proportion to truth. So if I said, 75% of my employees left for an extra $1 an hour, chances are only 25% of your employees left for an extra $1 an hour. There's a bunch of other extenuating circumstances. So we did some good in-depth interviews and we got some good feedback. And the feedback was, we were a new grad, but the average engineering age within NASA was about 28 years. They've had a tenure of 28 years. So they remember when Challenger blew up. And when Challenger blew up, it created a risk-adverse culture of compliance and make sure you cover yourself, right, in case anything happens again. Now the values, we talk about values, the values on the wall said innovation, teamwork, collaboration, all these things that made us want to be part of NASA's thinking I can live to those values. But when I brought myself forward to demonstrate and live those values, it was met against a culture of risk aversion. So you might say innovation, but you actually really don't want to live innovation because you're afraid, right?
Yeah, not living the values like you talked about
Not living
earlier.
the values. And so we used our platform for a period of time just to say, in all of our meetings and our interactions, can we preemptively select a value to live and actually demonstrate that value in that meeting or that interaction? And we'll monitor that over a time period and we'll correlate that with engagement. And what we found is, I think it was greater than 85% felt that they were a more cohesive unit, more cohesive team, that they actually felt they were living the values. We collected over a few thousand different engagement interactions. And again, using AI, we were able to paint a narrative of how the organization was, and using all the collective actions, how they're transforming into. We measured mood, sentiment, and tone, and all these things start to create a very different story, which further reinforce the positivity of what they're trying to do.
What an amazing example.
Thanks
It was
for
a lot of
sharing
fun.
that. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, this solution works with NASA.
Right?
From a complexity standpoint,
Yeah.
NASA's not known for being a simplistic organization.
Yeah. And
sounds
ultimately
like-
it comes down to behaviors. And that was, regardless if it's a complex aeronautics or aerospace engineering firm, or, we're in healthcare environments, we're in different manufacturing environments where we do lots in law enforcement and first responder environments. And so that notion of it really comes to, what am I going to do as a response to my employee population? If they're giving me feedback, like you said, can I do something with it? And the challenge has been, how can we create that data view simple enough that as a leader, I don't need to have all kinds of degrees in organizational psychology or anything like that. I can see the data and know the response that I need to take.
I love how you shared, the different organizations or different industries that have this problem. Is this, in your experience, is this problem with workforce engagement and living to the values and translating the values kind of industry agnostic, or is there any specific industries that struggle with it more than others?
I think right now it's industry agnostic. Going back to that poll of 70% of Canadians, that was a broad poll across all different industries. I mentioned first responders. What we know is in the first 5 years after a recruit graduates from the academy, they lose 50% of their new recruits, especially in the U.S. And so that's a huge investment in getting these officers ready for service to lose half of them. The other interesting fact with law enforcement is if engagement is high within the overall department and organization, then the use of violence on the street drops dramatically. The use of the officer safety incidents drops dramatically. So there's a moral imperative as well to create a more engaged workforce, aside from just keeping your employees.
Did that study that you're referencing, or have you seen other studies, just putting you on the spot here, so if you don't know the answer, just let me know.
Yeah.
So I know. But does it monetize the value or the cost of this problem for some of these studies that they've done? If you're losing half your workforce, or 70% are wanting to leave, and like you mentioned, all the upfront costs and the training and the effort put into people, as well as people putting into the organization just to kind of restart over. I imagine the monetary cost, as well as what you just shared with us with enforcement and all the other safety issues that can come into that as well.
Yeah, so there are lots of different studies on that monetization. There's no real set number, but I'll give you some well-regarded ranges of those numbers. For typically a frontline employee, the cost to have that employee turnover is about 40%. For that middle management range or supervisor or things like that, it's about 100% of their salary. And as you get into the senior realms, that could be up to 300% of their annual salary, right? And so if I have an organization that's only 1,000 employees, but I'm dealing with a 15-20% turnover, somewhere throughout the organization that's costing me greater than $1 million a year. And so there's a huge cost imperative to resolving that.
Yeah, that's massive.
Yeah.
Not to mention the safety issues and other areas that impact clients and people and team members.
It's a ripple effect all the way through, yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. So for the audience that's listening, if they're, having this problem, whether they're, maybe the owner of the organization or the employee kind of, struggling with understanding their values and how it ties into an organization's values, is there any questions or actions that they should be thinking of, that the audience should be doing or thinking or asking themselves?
Yeah, so if I talk to just the employee first, the one thing I would want to say is it always starts with one, right? You just need someone brave enough to step forward to try to make a difference in organizations and to encourage others, to invite others to kind of make that same difference. And I've seen time and time again the power of one in an organization to actually influence. So regardless of where you are, the position you hold, don't be afraid to try to step forward and do that. Look at the organization first and say, is there an opportunity that I can do some things differently to create a better workspace for the people that work around me? For the organizations themselves, I'd say, not only is it something that's just good to do because it feels good, there is, as we talked about, the cost benefits. There's market longevity benefits. I think of studies like Jim Collins in Good to Great, where he talks about those level 5 leaders. Those level 5 leaders look at the overall organization, right? It's out the window. So there's cost benefits. There's safety benefits to organizations. Look at all of those metrics. You want to move in an upward direction and say, if I focus on culture, I have an opportunity to move all of these metrics in the right direction.
Great advice and great, something to really sink our teeth into and think about.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Rick. Before we wrap up this episode, is there anything else you'd like to share with us and the audience?
No, I think if you have any questions, I'd love to have a conversation. You can find me on LinkedIn. Our organizational website is www.blazeperformance.ca, and I'm always around Calgary for a coffee.
Oh, wonderful. And I'll put your website on this video so they can go to your website and learn more about Blaze Performance there. And right before we kicked off this episode, you mentioned, I believe, you're going to kickstart your podcasts up again.
I am.
Is that coming on your website?
Yeah. So we've had a podcast a while ago. We put out about 40 episodes. We're going to do it again. This one work-related. It's called The Humans of HR. And we've had an opportunity to interview senior HR leaders all across the spectrum of industries, really about, what are the people challenges that they're trying to face today. And so that will likely launch back again in June, and I'd love to hear some feedback on that as you start to listen to some of those.
Very exciting. I'm looking forward to hearing them.
Yeah, they'll be great.
Well, thank you so much, Rick. Appreciate you coming today.
Thank you.
This wraps up this episode of Unstoppable Journeys, discussing solutions to problems to help make your journey unstoppable. Thank you for joining, and have a great day.